Impact within the 1960s. Around that same time, within the same year, the disenfranchisement of black voters across the South through discriminatory voting laws, intimidation, and violence started to become an uproar at an accelerated rate. Certain members within the SNCC began branching out and putting themselves in certain environments to recruit younger, uneducated people to properly join in legal and safe voting acts. Within the next few years, the organization continued to educate, protest, and mobilize unfortunate black communities in areas such as voting, new movement tactics, and etc. In 1964, the SNCC and other similar organizations pinpointed their focus on the state of Mississippi to increase black voter registration and establish freedom schools for black children throughout the states. Freedom schools, the freedom libraries, the freedom housing, everything that was created basically solely from that freedom summer was excruciatingly effective. Even with creating new tactics for protesting against racial discrimination, the Nonviolent Committee was still met with hard resistance by local law enforcement officials and members of the KKK. With no regard for human life, by the end of that summer, titled the Freedom Summer, continuously had hundreds of volunteers brutally beaten, and at least 3 volunteers were murdered. Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman were local white men from New York, and James Shaney, I hope I'm saying his name right, was a local Mississippi black man. And those 3 names were the main 3 names talked about throughout those beatings. And they were brutally murdered by law enforcement officials, members of the KKK, and any hatred, angrily people that do not want to see the African American community progress in any way. So, according to the history website, in 1964, the Democratic Party held a national convention where they stated that their plan was to replace the all-white Mississippi delegation with one from the integrated Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Due to this decision, negative reactions were had by members of the SNCC, which caused a divide between other similar organizations who took a liking towards everything the SNCC stood for. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. In simple terms, this act was made to prohibit any racial discrimination in a voting environment, meaning all walks of life can vote. With this new act passed and applicable towards any and all people, certain organizations want to use the opportunity to try and get more people of color in the political system to possibly pass more acts that all citizens of America must abide by, not just black people or white people or whoever. Within the next few years, the SNCC started to divert and move with different tactics as new chairmen were constantly being put in this position of power within the organization, which started to give the SNCC a new name and a new image to the public eye. Now, quickly, before we move on to the back half of the presentation, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That was a very important law or act that was passed in the middle of the 1960s, right in the not in the middle of civil rights movement, but right in the middle of where the SNCC were technically in its prime, or they were in good gracious with how they were moving and being organized. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This law came into existence after the brutal murders on voting right activists happened in Mississippi and the horrific march across the bridge in Selma, Alabama. One of the biggest, most impactful, and important laws that's ever been active within the political system, passed and signed on August 6, 1965 by former U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson. Immediately, the percentages of black votes has increased astronomically by having close to 250,000 black voters be registered by the end of that year, which is 1/3 of all voters within the next election year. Black voters within the nation, but specifically within the South, saw an uproar in people wanting to make impactful change within the political system, and it was solely due because of the Voting Rights Act. The more people that we can get to vote is the reason is such a big topic today. If we can get more people to vote, regardless, we can possibly see more systematic and political change within this country. Besides just people not being educated on how to vote, properly vote, what voting means to this country, and what voting means as an individual and a citizen, as somebody who was living in this country. So, the historical context behind the SNCC. Why was the SNCC important to the lives of African Americans and just important in general? The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was very impactful throughout the 1960s as it was a major part of civil rights events throughout that time. creating a lot of events for people to come out and volunteer and to just be a part of, and to just not feel as though that they are not a part of a movement, especially a movement that is mostly unsafe. And with the SNCC, they were trying to create safe environments for the youth to come out and be a part of. The youth is our future. The youth is what can make it, is what can take this longer than we ever imagined. Besides the sit-ins, the freedom rides, and the 1963 March on Washington, as well as educating people within the community on how to properly vote and protest, the SNCC was a major organization that allowed the people to feel comfortable with protesting. I believe throughout all my research, it's always been the SNCC was a safe space, no matter what happened throughout the events, because that wasn't their fault. They were still on non-violent tactics. If there was something that occurred that wasn't non-violent, it wasn't because they went out of their way to pursue that. The organization helped create a sense of Black strength and Black power without having to be abrupt in having to act out in such a way. It impacted and brought in hundreds of thousands of young individuals from all throughout the nation, but specifically the South, by staying consistent within the nonviolent approach that helped transform the lives of African Americans in the late 1900s and today. By reaching out to other organizations, to similar organizations, by having the SNCC create certain events that was very impactful for the lives of African Americans, where if there was no SNCC, if there was no L. Baker, if there was no 4 students from NCAT trying to be a part of a movement, none of this would be going on. Throughout the 1960s, the SNCC was very, very impactful. I almost want to say they ran the 1960s, basically like how Jordan ran the 1990s in basketball. It was just their time. I'm not going to say it felt right, but what they were doing, the 1960s was just for them. With everything going on, with them being not affiliated, but them being associated, or them getting help from similar organizations, especially with Dr. Martin Luther King, Diane Nash, L. Baker, some other people as well, like some other people as well. They just that was giving them leadership and knowledge on what to do, right and wrong. But unfortunately, there was a downfall of the SNCC within the late 1960s, like 67, 68, 69, towards the early 1970s. So after the event of the Democratic National Convention occurring in 1964, there was a divide between certain organizations. That divide led to gaining a new chairman for the SNCC in Stokely Carmichael, replacing John Lewis in 1966. Although Carmichael was a part of the original Freedom Riders in 1961, with SNCC under new supervision, the organization started to take a drift in original values and ideologies. Carmichael was then replaced with Herbert Rapp Brown in 1967, who then tried to form an alliance with other organizations like the Black Panther Party. And of course, the Black Panther Party wasn't solely focused on nonviolent tactics. They were focused on getting their point across by any means possible. And that kind of wasn't the way that the SNCC was going. They were solely based on nonviolent, not trying to reach out to possibly violent organizations to try and reach a grander scale. So after slowly drifting away from tactics that started the organization in the first place, the new chairman, Herbert Brown, changed what the N stood for in the organization from nonviolent to national. So now at this time in the early 1970s, the SNCC stands for the Student National Coordinating Committee, which is no longer riding on that image of nonviolent. Over the years, after more and more effective laws were being passed and civil rights movement started to take a divide and expand in more ways than ever before, the SNCC started to lose members income, any sort of affiliation with any other organizations. They started to lose that as they were losing what they stood for. The SNCC, some interesting facts. The SNCC stood out to focus on the youth as they realized that they were the future. Like I stated earlier, by letting the nation see that young innocent people can lead and be a part of the movement, but in their own way. not letting their environments dictate who they are, but by expanding upon that environment and making connections with similar people across the nation state lines, the southern nation state lines. In 1964, the SNCC joined the SCLC Corps and the NAACP to create Freedom Summer in Mississippi. The Freedom Summer was an amazing event held by those organizations for college students from all over, regardless of background, race, and economic stature. The Freedom Summer gathered students from all over to help them get registered to vote, as well as getting educated on voting in this country. Freedom Summer. So, before the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, there was a disenfranchisement of black voters within this country. Of course, black people in this country being limited by laws and racial discriminatory actions towards voting. The summer of 1964, the SNCC and other similar civil rights activist organizations focused on creating a campaign around how to change that. I personally believe that the Freedom Summer happening a year before the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, I believe was a major influence as to how it happened. Not only was the murders and the march happening and these campaigns happening to try and get political people's views and eyesight what's happening around this, but I do feel as though that this major event happening just one summer before the summer of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed in 1965, I feel as though that this was a major impact. It created a subgenre of the Freedom Summer in freedom houses, freedom schools, freedom libraries, each subgenre for creating free educational systems, housing, and libraries for children within the South to be educated on voting, how to protest, what to properly do within the community, how to make it home. Freedom Summer was one of the most impactful collaborative meetups during the civil rights movement as it affected the lives of the youth, students, and other members of the community. So, my conclusion. African American lives today wouldn't be as progressive if it wasn't for organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Their significance is through uplifting the black community by reaching out to the youth and educating them on how to properly be effective in this country, by making the community feel as though that they were a part of the movement without harming the individuals within the movement, systematically wanting to make change before the system make change. A civil rights movement led by strong-minded, kind-hearted, and powerful individuals like L. Baker, Martin Luther King Jr., Marion Barry, and so many more. From taking tactics used by previous unorganized organizations and making them more effective by putting somewhat powerful people in positions to make real change. The SNCC was an amazing organization that was created by like-minded, powerful, strong-minded people. And I hate that it ended. There was no more in 1973. The SNCC was no more. It was shut down as an organization. But you can still learn more about the SNCC through websites, books, and everything. So with that being said, thank you so much for listening throughout my 15-minute presentation. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of hard work, and I really hope that I did it correctly. So thank you, Professor, for an amazing semester, and you have a good one.